But the tragedy of life, because life is tragic, because the more you try to touch the ineffable, going towards the Godhead, you never reach it. Ever, ever, ever. Moses did not get into Israel. And you never can create achdut. Ever. It's impossible. You can only try to imitate it with digits, ones and zeros. That's all it is. I understand that tragedy. And I have to constantly do something to get out of it. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll. What can I tell you?
That was Zvi Howard Rosenman discussing the song Knitted Together, which I wrote after being inspired by Psalm 18. I'm Shep Rosenman. This is The Rest is Commentary, where we discuss what songs inspired in the Psalms inspire in my guests. This episode is dedicated to the memory of my dear friend Ivan Wolkind, who also served as inspiration for this song. His yahrzeit, the anniversary of his death, took place this past week. May his memory continue to be a blessing, and may his family, our chosen family, find some comfort during this time when comfort is in short supply. While Ivan was a chosen brother, Zvi is my biological brother. Zvi is an award-winning producer, Call Me By Your Name, The Family Man, The Main Event, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and more, documentarian, Common Threads, Paragraph 175, and more, educator, writer, actor, and author. His new book, Call Me By My Name, will be released in September 2025. Look for it wherever books are sold. Zvi and I will be talking about music as a bridge for connection and expression, the ways grief and joy can coexist. Platonic love, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Complexity as a value and as lived experience. Romantics and cynics, identity and authenticity, art and activism as fuels for social justice, how discovering the divine in our everyday relationships can transform our lives, and so much more. Let's start off by listening to Knitted Together.
Salutes, folded flag marks your apartness. Wherever you are, my friend, you light up our darkness. Don't need a lamp or artless reflection. Memories help us feel your bright shield of protection. Favorites, you got back, turned on some Lou Reed after a night on patrol, full of danger and mystery. It's 1 a.m., you were drinking a whiskey and coke, family asleep, you were telling joke after joke. Your barrel-chested hugs last forever. Gunfight, hunger grabbing at you. You started the charcoal grilling, flames charring the chicken. You needed that type of fulfilling. I remember you refilling your whiskey and coke. Moments etched in my mind, tiny details that help me to cope. Your barrel-chested hugs misty night, to be there for each other's families. That's what it means to have knitted souls, inseparable parts, unending whole. Months in a garage sale later, hanging in my closet is your black tactical vest with all of those zippers and pockets. Each holds a river, every droplet warming me, flowing through my heart, adorning my soul with your memory. Souls knitted together.
Hi, Zvi.
Hey, Shep, how are you?
It's so good to see you, my brother, even though I just saw you a day or two ago for lunch.
Yes, it is so great to see you. I feel like I'm 100 years older than you.
It's only 18 and a half to 20, depending on whom you ask and when. So here's my question for you. It's the same question I ask everyone else. I believe that the songs I write are gifts I receive from the muse, from God, or whatever, and I offer those gifts as gifts to people I love and respect, mentors, friends, in our case, brother and friend, actual blood brother. That's an important for the conversation we're going to have. And I offer it to you in hopes that it inspires something in you. I don't really care if it's love or loathing, hope or hatred, questions, commentary, anything. And so my question for you is, what did this song, Knitted Together, inspire in you?
I'll tell you this much. It made me cry.
Wow. Why?
I'm going to cry now because it's so heavy. Number one, I think it's your best song. Okay.
Thank you.
And number two, the R&B of it all, brings me to that place in me that is my place. I like hard rock is for you. Those trumpets, it's just brings me back to Sam and Dave. It brings me back to, my days at Arthur, my days dancing constantly to R&B and all of that. So right away, it brought me there. So it brought me back about 55 years, but it's where I live. And then as I started understanding that the song was about Ivan and you, it gripped me so hard because I realized when I told you I wanted you to do a Tehillim about the love of David for Jonathan, you did it in such a big level that it was transcendent. Knitted souls, sarur b'tzor achayim. It's like, that's what it's about. Connection.
Right.
Life is about connection, and you made that connection to me. And I realized how important Ivan was in your life and what a big void his death created for you. And that image of you on the beach with Ivan talking after Cokes and whiskey about the covenant that you made between yourselves to protect each other's family. That is really incredible. It just brings up for me,
Take your time.
all the love, which is never ending.
Wow. Well, I mean, I'm glad I moved you, but I certainly don't want to be making you cry, you know. I mean, look, at the end of the day, we all experience music differently. And it sounds like you experienced both the joy of dancing at Studio 54 and MK and Arthur, but also your powerful loss all bound up in the same song. Does that sound right?
Yeah. But rhythm and blues, I think I've explained this to you before. Rhythm and blues is like church music. It's like trying to touch the ineffable.
Mm-hmm.
The glory and the joy is going towards it. But then the heartbreak is that you could never do it. So R&B is the rhythms of joy, but the lyrics of sadness. Ain't no mountain high enough. I can't get to you, oh Lord, which then becomes transmogrified into I love you so much, baby. Oh, fuck. Kick me, hurt me, leave me. And the opposition of joy and grief in R&B is what moves me, and that's what moved me in this song. Because there's joy in the musicality of it, and the trumpets of R&B and sitting on the dock of the bay and all of that, and then the grief of losing your best friend. How do you ever recover from that?
Yeah.
And I have lost so many best friends, so many, and so many boyfriends, and so many lovers, and mommy and daddy and Bernstein and Tom, and it just goes on and on and on. Now that I'm going to be 80, just today, right before I got on this, I read that a friend of mine died, Martha Luttrell.
I remember hearing the name, but I had never met her.
She was a big agent at ICM. She handled a lot of big talent, and she helped me a lot in my career. And she was my age, died of pancreatic cancer. And just whenever I read, she died of pancreatic cancer, brings me to Susan.
Who's Susan, for those who don't know?
Our double cousin, Zvi. My name is Zvi. Her name is Zvi. We were both named after our grandfather, who was a sofer, a scribe. And Zvi and I were the same age. And we were double cousins because Shep and my father's older brother married our mother's older sister. So I had a cousin that had the same genetics as I do, essentially. She died of pancreatic cancer. And I went to visit her with another cousin of mine in Long Island about 7 or 8 years ago. And I just never got over it. I don't get over any of it. Any of it.
Okay. I have so many questions. She's only dead 7 or 8 years? Isn't it longer?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, but look, there's something very powerful to that on several levels. First of all, we're in the middle of the stories of our ancestors, and this past week we read Vayetze, in which Yaakov works for 7 years for Leah and 7 years for Rachel and 5 years for each of the sheep. But 7, with Hanukkah coming up, 7, I'm now in the mystical place. 7 is the number of nature. It's what's natural. It's why we have statutory protections for people to work for up to 7 years, because biblically, a slave worked for 7 years before the slave was supposed to be let free. Correct. It's a natural cycle. Hanukkah and Sukkot are cycles of 8 because they are out of nature. They are supernatural. If your cycles of love were 7 years, whether due to death or I'm going to go with dismemberment of the relationship, okay, there's a natural cycle there. It lived its cycle. But the key is you've been in and out of several long-term relationships, and you've had this underlying processing of grief that you've had to manage and deal with, given the people you know who've died, between AIDS and just people you know in your life. How do you process that? How do you kind of continue with that? How do you, as you said, how do you lose not only a best friend, but several best friends and get up to work and live and pitch and tell stories another day?
I was born a romantic and an optimist, and I've been very lucky, and I've made 43 movies. 44 movies. I've had big hits. I've had big flops. I've been through it all. And every morning when I wake up, I have to gird my loins for war. When I read the Tehillim, the one that you did,
Psalm 18.
yeah, it is so filled with the girding yourself for war and the drama of the fights and of the things that David went through. And it's so dramatic and so beautiful in Hebrew. It's just gorgeous, and you can't translate that into English. It's impossible because there's nothing like it, and it does have a mystical, kol halapidim, kol hashofar, kol zva mazaka. It's all of that in there in that one Tehillim. It's just so expressive.
Can you translate what you just said in Hebrew, even though I agree with you that a translation, any translation is always less than, but we can still do our best to approximate.
Allah ashan ba'apo ve'esh mitim tochel gechalim ba'aru mimenu. It's just Vayat Shamayim Vayered Va'arafel Tafat Raglam. How do you translate Arafel, which is so gorgeous, the word itself?
Yeah.
You can't translate that.
Well, let's see how Svarya translates it, which I think this is the Koren translation, 8 through 10. Then the earth rocked and quaked. The foundations of the mountains shook, rocked by God's indignation. That's, I would say, accurate, but not as powerful as the Hebrew. Smoke went up from God's nostrils. From God's mouth came devouring fire. Live coals blazed forth from God. And here's the last one. God bent the sky. That, I think, does a good job of translating the Hebrew. Bending the sky. I mean, what an image, and came down, thick cloud beneath God's feet. So I think thick cloud is a technical interpretation of Arafel, but it's so much more than that. It's the heavens, the horizon, all of that.
It doesn't convey the mystical transcendence of what David's feeling. It's so dramatic in Hebrew. Now, what I wondered is when I said to you, I want you to do the Tehillim about Jonathan and David, where in this Tehillim is that? I saw the Shmuel, the Samuel,
right,
the stuff, but is the fight that David's fighting for Jonathan?
All right, so it comes in the first verse. So I'll look at it in the English. The words of the song to the Lord, it's in verse 1, after the Lord had saved him, David, from the hands of all his enemies and from the clutches of Saul. So I just want to look at the Hebrew for that for a minute. Mikaf kol oivavu miyad Shaul. That's the language we recite before every tachanun, before every prayer, where after we've had our direct encounter with God in the Amidah, in the silent Amidah, where we've thanked God, we've made requests, we've said, I'm sorry, we've requested peace. After you've done all of that, it's such a powerful experience that all you can do is fall on your face. And this language is the introduction to that process.
Explain what Tachanun is.
Tachanun means requests, essentially. But it's much more than that. Again, we're talking about the beauty of the Hebrew language. The root of the word tachanun, el rachum v'chanon, means compassionate. But the root of the word compassionate is also chen, sweetness. In order to be compassionate, there's got to be a sweetness to God. So God is an el rachum v'chanon, a mercy and compassion. And when we say tachanun, it's a bidirectional construct. We are falling on our faces to remind God that we are sweet and we are compassionate and therefore are worthy of God's compassion and mercy. That's the bidirectionality of Tachanun. And that's why this is a particularly powerful Tehillim psalm, because in the midst of this chanun, this that we're getting into, this compassion, we're talking about God's strength, God as rock and God as savior, but also David's strength. And that's what you pointed out before. It's fascinating on that score, because the psalm itself has so many conflicting emotions. It goes directly to your description of R&B. And my favorite example of this in the Psalms canon, I think it's Psalm 3, maybe it's Psalm 6, but the psalmist tells us to gilu bir'adah, rejoice in trembling. And I think that notion of balance and that notion of complexity is at the core of what the Jewish mission is. Look, you don't have to believe in God, in my opinion, to be Jewish. You don't have to believe in God to explore Judaism, but the tenets of Judaism, whether God is part of the picture or not, includes the Psalms and the psalmist. And the psalmist says, hey, folks, life is really complex. You have to find joy even in fear, even in sadness. You have to find tenderness, compassion, even in the midst of military might and violence. You started by talking about the connection to Ivan, and I want to go back. For those, we didn't really set the table, but this way, but it's important to note that, I asked my brother if he would be a guest on my podcast. You were one of the first people I asked, Zvi. And when I asked my brother to join me, he as he said before, I want you to write about the love of Jonathan and David. And, you never said this explicitly, but I knew that you wanted me to explore that vein of scholarship that suggested that David and Jonathan might be lovers. And I did. I don't know, did I ever share with you what I wrote for that?
No.
This was like, if you will, my first draft. So this is before it became about Ivan. This is when I was trying to write to your prompt. I remember the taste of your lips in that stolen moment, wet with wine, slick with honey, the scent of lamb and za'atar in your beard, the sound of battle ringing in your ears. You grabbed me with the hunger that comes after. All right, so this was my attempt to try to make David and Jonathan lovers, because the text is very explicit about their love relationship. And it comes from Shmuel. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Right? That's chapter Samuel 1, chapter 18. I think that's verse 3. Anyway, so I really wrestled with that, trying to kind of honor where you were coming from in your request. Because we often kid about this stuff, I don't know if it's okay to say this, but she spent 40 days in the desert, right? That's a reference. Take your pick, to Moses or to Jesus. They had to be gay. They wore a dress. They wore sandals, etc., and so on. So I really tried to find that sense of play. I recently wrote a song when I did the Taylor Swift challenge that my friend Shanna led. She asked us to write a song in the voice of a TV character. I wrote a song in the voice of Aegon from House of Dragons. She asked us to write a song in the voice of someone who is not your gender, who's not your age. I wrote a song in the voice of Rosie, Ivan's eldest daughter. So I have the capacity to write from another perspective, but for me, as I was writing this, I did not feel authentic. And maybe it's just because of the way I was brought up and the learning I did, I felt like the love of Jonathan and David that is described in Shmuel and in this Tehillim, and I'm going to answer your question after this, it's something that's transcendent of sex. It doesn't mean that there wasn't sex. I'm not commenting upon that. That's relevant for those who are interested in the sex piece of this. I was interested in the love, if you will, the love as a platonic virtue, not qua platonic friends, but as something virtuous, a standard to live up to. And that I felt was much more authentic, which is how ultimately I made my way to writing about Ivan, who's been, if not the subject of, then certainly an inspiration for a wide variety of songs that touch on his life or are connected to him. I wrote one about my dog, about Artemis, but that was because I was writing about grief and I couldn't write about Ivan, so I wrote about Artemis. Anyway, to answer your question, where does Jonathan come up? He's not named explicitly, but there are a variety of psalms that the commentators say are connected to or about the conflicts between David and Saul and Jonathan's role in them. And this is one of them. And it's that language, Biyom hitzil Hashem oto mikaf kol oyevav umiyad Shaul. So the English for that is, after the Lord had saved David from the hands of all of David's enemies and from the clutches of Saul. Who saved David from Saul? Jonathan. And if we go back and we look at the text in chapter 18, I gave you specifically wanted this language, Zvi Israel, not only because it's your name in Hebrew, but the language is just glorious, Do you want to talk about why?
Well, Zvi means deer, D-E-E-R, in Hebrew. And the deer is the national symbol of Israel because God called the nation of Israel Eretz HaTzvi. Now, that's not a name in the Bible, but God called the nation of Israel the land of the deer. But the deer, Kabbalistically, means glory, Tzvi Tifara. And then in this sentence, Tzvi Israel, the glory of Israel, al bamotecha halal, on your disgusting arts.
A bama is literally a place where you sacrifice for idol worship, but Koren translates it as lies slain on your heights.
Right. Or bama could be stage, on your platforms, on your things that you present. Eich naflu giborim. How did heroes die? And he's talking, it's a love song.
Totally. Right, and if you go down to 22, it makes it clear that it's Jonathan. The bow of Jonathan never turned back. The sword of Saul never withdrew empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and cherished, never parted in life or in death. And for me, the most fascinating part of this part of the Navi, and we see other examples of it, the prophets, is that like mommy and daddy, whoever pissed them off were dead to them. And, like they weren't going to cry when they died. But here David is glorifying Saul in particular, because Jonathan defended David, but Saul was trying to kill David. And yet he refers to, he says, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in crimson and finery, who decked your robes with jewels of gold. This is someone to envy, to not to worship, because we don't worship people, but someone to laud and applaud and appreciate, notwithstanding the fact that he was an enemy who was trying to kill David. And that, too, reinforces this notion of complexity that I think is at the heart of what Judaism is all about. And that's why, and I've said this in other contexts, I think that's why we're not called Bnei Yaakov. We're not called the sons or children of Jacob. We're called Bnei Yisrael. It's the name of Jacob that specifically talks about how to struggle with God. And Again, you don't have to believe in God to believe in the process of being an Israelite, which is to struggle and wrestle with these kinds of complexity.
Tell where that comes from. It comes from the Bible itself, where Jacob has a dream that he's wrestling with God, and God then rips his spine or his head, and he limps for the rest of his life. But he's struggling with God, and that is the nature of being Jewish. Struggling with the concepts of God, struggling with every single concept. That's what it's so beautiful about it. Where it gets tricky for me is when it becomes dogmatically theocratic. So it's like Bi'arta harab mikirbecha and Al tifrosh mehat tzibur. I don't know whether it's the Bible or whether it's the Gemara.
It's from Kitetse.
Bi'arta harab mikirbecha. You have to burn out the evil in your midst. The whole thing about Judaism is about conformity. And that's the struggle that I've always had that you've recognized. You spoke about it, Rabbi Kasher, on his podcast with you. I grew up in the Eisenhower 50s, where everybody wore the same clothes and you lived in the same street-level house, and everybody was the same. And it was Mamie Eisenhower's hats and her gloves, and everybody wore them, like Donna Reed. And if you stepped away from that, you were considered an enemy. And in 1949, I was born in 45, I stepped away from it because of whatever. And so my parents knew that I was gay. My aunt and uncle knew that I was gay since I was 4, and I lived with that. But I had to suppress it all during the 50s and early 60s because it was not cool to be gay in the Eisenhower years and in Far Rockaway, living in those split-level houses. And when I stepped away from it, I paid a very heavy price, I guess, although for me it was so liberating.
Well, what do you mean you paid a heavy price? But again, I want to underscore this point. You paid a heavy price and it was liberating. It was both of those things.
Yeah.
What was liberating and what was the heavy price?
Well, liberating was the fact that I could go away from all of that, experience sexuality and experience a lot of sex and experience drugs, sex, and rock and roll, which my era glorified and which I lived through. And from the moment of the Stonewall Rebellion, when I came to New York after I left medical school in 1967, men could not dance with other men. You had to dance, you had to be in a circle of men, and there was a woman at the center. Okay? In fact, I once did that with Edie Sedgwick, who was in the middle of the floor with a cast and a strut. And she was rubbing that strut into the floor. It was so amazing to watch. But all the gay bars were by the mafia. And there was a fat guy on a stool. And if he saw you touching another man, he would shine the flashlight on you. If he shined it on you 3 times, they called the NYPD. How did I know this? Because I had a boyfriend who was a cop who was gay, who told me this. So whenever I saw in the Stonewall itself, I wasn't there that night. I was there many times before. I saw the light twice. I was out of there. That's how Stonewall happened, because the fat guy shone the flashlight 3 times, and then the cops came. And one of these cops put his hands on Marsha, the trans person, who was very butch and strong. And so when the cop put his hand on Marsha's shoulder, she decked him. And then the cops came on it. And then all the gay people in the bar turned on the cops. And then it fell out into the streets. And I was there 5 days where they burnt 20 police cars. That was Stonewall. And from the time of that in 1969, 6 months later, the law was overturned about gay people dancing with each other. And then it was this incredible expression of creativity on all levels, on architecture, on music, on fashion, on art, on the communications, on entertainment. It was like a whoosh of glory, okay? At Zvi Israel. I so identified with that because I had volunteered for the Six-Day War in 1967. And I was there with Rabbi Goren blew the shofar on Har HaBayit on the Temple Mount. I was there. And I had a very kind of inexplicable reaction because I was kind of religious until that point. And then when that happened, I realized I don't have to be religious anymore. I just wrapped myself up in the Israeli flag. And I became what is essentially what I am now, kind of right-wing Zionist, except that it's been moderated by having compassion for Arabs, which I never really had before recently. So the incredible liberation, 1969 of Stonewall, which was based on the liberation of Jerusalem. The Stonewall liberation, the people that were in the New York City Council were all Jewish young gay guys. And they trod on the shoulders of the people that liberated Jerusalem openly. Okay? And even though now they won't like to admit it, that's what really happened. Because I knew those guys on the city council. And they were all gay. And they were all Jewish. Some of them far Rockaway. And they changed that law. And that law, that liberation of the gay people was the same liberation that we did in 1967 about Jerusalem. And we did in Moses' year.
It's also at the core of the rest of the civil rights movement, which was happening right at that time.
And it was very, very, very liberating on so many levels. Sexually, I just fucked my brains out.
Why are you speaking in the past tense? You're still doing that.
And then it was like, men and women, I didn't give a shit. It was just like, I gotta get out there. And I felt the liberation from the chains of oppression that I felt from the community in Far Rockaway, you know. And even though I loved a lot of it, which I still do, but the liberation was so extreme. And then I met a world that was so different than the world that I grew up with. I met geniuses. Stephen Sondheim, Leonard Bernstein, Edward Albee, Hal Prince, Jerry Robbins, Arthur Lawrence. It never stopped. And I thought, oh my God, I'm just going to be meeting all these geniuses. Well, I'm still looking. But the liberation of that era and that concatenation of people that were in New York from 1967 to 1978, 79, that'll never happen again. All the ballet people, Nureyev and, you know, the great ballet masters and Balanchine and, you know,
Andy Warhol.
Warhol, that'll never happen again. And then, like in an abrupt crash, like in a fucking movie, AIDS, which stopped everything.
Yeah.
For me and all my friends that were dying. And then I myself was diagnosed with AIDS, but it was a misdiagnosis. It turns out that I had a lactose intolerance, and Shirley MacLaine discovered it. But I lived with that diagnosis from 1983 to 1987 because there was no test for AIDS until 1987.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the question that started this section, which was you had glory, you experienced glory, but you also paid a price. What was the price you paid?
Al bamotecha halal. That's the price that I paid. Halal. Because because I was living this incredibly different life from the life that I was brought up in and the life that was supposed to be laid out for me, being a doctor and buying a split-level house and getting married and have kids, the barking of the dogs, the winds howling in my brain for the guilt that I felt for all of this, that the only way that I could assuage that guilt and the yelping and the barking of the dogs and the who were following me, the only way that I could assuage is by drugs. So I naturally quieted it all by drugs or sex. That's, and even though I don't take drugs now, because I've been sober since 1983, sex is the only thing that where I can actually have sex and not have to think about the Gaza, and not have to think about the 100 hostages, and not have to think about the 2,800 of my friends that died, and not have to think about life is lost, and not have to think about my own coming death, because I am wrestling now with Christians and mortality at the age of 80, and it's hard. So the only thing that calms that down, I can watch television and Netflix, but that never calms it down. The only thing that erases it is when I am in the arms of another God.
Well, so look, this goes to the notion of existence, right? Like I love watching TV. I watch a lot of it. I go to movies, love reading books. For me, that's a passive consumer experience. And it doesn't go towards my existentiality. But when I'm hiking with Shari, when we're just holding hands, when we're having more intimate moments, when I'm writing songs, when I'm with my kids and we're playing games, those are the moments of connection that help transcend the time that we have on this plane. And so for you, it's sex, but it's also, 7 years of relationships with Tim or David. And I don't know how long you've been with Pablo.
As I've gotten older, I've had to transcend my own feelings about all that stuff, the limits that I placed on myself. I think religion is based on, it's like the courts of Versailles in the French. There were so many rules and protocols about everything, about the color of the dress you were wearing, about the length of the sleeve. All those rules were made to distract the nobility from killing the king. Religion, all those rules are made to distract the people from the concept that it's all going to end. Because it's impossible to think about it. And that's why religion was created by those rabbis with the long white beards. Hello.
Yeah, I'm going to offer an alternative perspective. And I truly believe what I'm about to say, which is that there is no right answer except the right answer for you. If having that worldview helps ground you and allows you to have a more meaningful and joyful life, to quote Daddy, gay gesundheit. And I always noted that it was especially ironic when he said gay gesundheit to you, because it has a whole other context if you want to do word punning with Yiddish. But I want to offer this alternative because your approach is very cynical. And for someone who's a self-described idealist and romantic, it's hard for me to make that shtim. Like, we've often had a conversation about the fact that as a lawyer, it's my job to be the cynic, the questioner, but the problem is kind of guy. But I also have the dreamer. That's what allows me to create. And you as a creator, as a producer, you're always in the dreamer modality. So for me, when it comes to the God piece of this, I don't view the rabbis as having created religion as a way to distract people from death. I view religion as, if you will, a technology that somebody smart meditated on, davened on, was blessed to tune into something greater than ourselves. Something. We as Jews don't define that. and this I did talk about with Rabbi Kasher, if I'm remembering this correctly, our, quote, definition of God, well, it comes in the first commandment, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, Asher Otziticha me'eretz Mitzrayim mibeit avim, that took you out of Egypt from the house of slavery. That's it. It doesn't tell you anything about God. And when Moshe asks God for God's name, the core definition, the essence of God, what's God's response? Eheyeh asher eheyeh. Not in the sense of Popeye, I am what I am, but I will be what I will be, which can mean lots of different things. Sharon Browse, my rabbi, says, Eheyeh asher eheyeh means God is always becoming. That God is of infinite potential, and it's our job to imitate God and also work on being of infinite potential, even if we feel limited in some way.
To answer your question about me being a cynic, I am a cynic and a romantic, because if you look at particle physics, light is both a wave and a particle, okay? We can hold two opposing ideas at once in our brain. I could be a romantic, which I am the biggest romantic, because I dream and I make from nothing into something. An idea comes into my head, and then it's a DVD or an MP3 that can be shown on the moon 100 years after I'm dead. Okay? And I've done that 43 times, and I hope to do more. And that's why I became a producer. I literally wanted to create things that were fungible, and you take that from your brain, the molecules, and put it into something real. And I am cynical at the same time because I've experienced life, and I have met these fucking lowlifes all over the world who are disgusting and liars and cheats. My friend Linda Opes, who just passed away, wrote a book called Hello, He Lied, which is my favorite expression in the world, because that's what it is in life. And I think that, except for you and Shari and Frady, there are very few people that I look at and say to myself, they're disgusting.
But I think, first of all, I always loved that phrase, hello, he lied. But I think what this again touches on this notion of complexity. I read a book, 1,000 years ago, probably the late 90s, by James Gleick called Chaos Theory. And I read other books about quantum physics, and our mutual friend Brent Travers just recommended me to a book called The One, How an Ancient Idea Holds the Future of Physics. And I think, just from the little bit I've gleaned, it's very connected to religious thinking. Pass's concept is that everything in the universe is fundamentally one. And we as Jews describe God as echad, oneness. And, why are we told to pursue imitatio Dei, to make ourselves in the image of God? Well, not only because the Torah says that we were made in the image of God, but it's an arc to move towards oneness, knowing that at the core of oneness is this complexity, this chaos that we're seeking to manage. And that's really where you get into conversations about lives of meaning. It's why Rav Soloveitchik wrote multiple books that focused on these issues, including The Lonely Man of Faith, the only book I read in English that I literally had to use a dictionary on every paragraph for, because some of the words were so big. And I then had to sit down with a friend of mine who had to explain it to me because it was so philosophically dense. But it's a beautiful book, the core of which is basically saying we as humans are alone, and we seek to connect with each other and to that which is greater than ourselves. And once you recognize that, the move of faith and religion, whether qua God or qua, as you put it, wrapping yourself in the Israeli flag, or qua building communities of queer people who are aligned to build social justice in the world, or the civil rights movement, or anything that is more powerful than you as an individual, now all of a sudden you're bringing something greater than yourself into the equation, and you're moving towards building meaning.
Yes, you're right about that. But the tragedy of life, because life is tragic, because the more you try to touch the ineffable, going towards the Godhead, you never reach it. Ever, ever, ever. Moses did not get into Israel. And you never can create achdut. Ever. It's impossible. You can only try to imitate it with digits, ones and zeros.
Yeah.
That's all it is. I understand that tragedy. And I have to constantly do something to get out of it. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll. What can I tell you?
That's actually a great place to end, though I do want to offer an alternative for people who can't abide living in tragedy, right? Because it's complex. I just read a book by an acquaintance of mine. I'm not going to say more than that, but it's a book about loss, and so we are confronted with that Ivan's loss every day, and yet. For me, and I don't know that this is true for everybody, but for me, I too am that dreamer and have that cynic, and for me as a dreamer romantic, what I choose to believe, the outlook I choose to undertake, except when I just can't, is when I'm writing the song and I play it and someone says, "Oh my God, Shep, you wrote that for me." In this particular case, I did write it for you, and I chose R&B because I know how much you love R&B. But when it moves people, now I feel like we've both actually transcended and touched for that brief moment. Those 4 minutes of that song and, this hour of this conversation. And that's where I find God in these conversations with people where it's meaningful. I had lunch today with Lee and Rabbi Barbara Zaki, and Rabbi Zaki's got such a fascinating story, and she's always so tender and warm and big-hearted. And like when I have conversations with her like that, I'm feeling the presence of something divine. When I learn with Rabbi Kasher, I inevitably feel something divine. When Nahum sings, oh my God, like I feel divinity right there. Same with hearing David Swirsky play guitar and my friend Gidon singing with that sweet voice of his. When Eitan plays me his new song, like, wow, that's awesome. Talk to me about how you created it.
And that's why we're creative. And I always explain the difference between Hasidism, that Europe was ruled by Talmudists and legalists. And if the Shabbos starts at 6:01 and you come home at 6:03, the Baal Shem Tov came and said, if Shabbos starts at 6:01 and you come at 6:04, if you sing a little song or dance a little dance or tell a tale with a moral added space, you're okay. So what the Baal Shem Tov was telling was that the acts of creation are like imitating the ineffable.
Yeah.
And that's why we do it, because we'll never get to it. The tragedy is we'll never get to it, but we can imitate it with digits and therefore make it happen. And that's my whole being, my whole life.
Yeah. Well, it's been a beautiful life. Ad mea ve'esrim ke'esrim. May you continue to live healthily, happily, producing and experiencing more love and joy and ineffable than grief, even though we're going to experience both. Thanks so much for listening. Special thanks to Zvi for joining me, to David Coyle and E-Rose for their help in producing this episode, and to Jessica Hannah Sweedler for her help on social media. You can find Knitted Together and all of the other songs in this song cycle on most platforms that stream or download music, including Spotify and Apple. In the next episode of The Rest is Commentary, I'll be talking with Rabbi Raphael Shore. We discuss the daily challenges and pain of living in a war zone. responsibility on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the importance of empathy, the role of education, optimism, and faith in achieving peace, the essentiality of listening to narratives on both sides, by contrast, the impact of propaganda and brainwashing undermining empathy, the faith and historical resilience of the Jewish people offering strength to face the Jewish people's current challenges. Despite facing these difficulties, joy can be found in the present, and so much more. All inspired by Rabbi Shor's thoughts after listening to She is Building, inspired by Psalm 84. Please join us.